Hi everyone, I'm Paolo Melchiorre, and today I'm talking to you about the Postgres generated column. I'm doing that using some example and using Django ORM and some beautiful picture from Italy to show you how to use this fantastic feature from Postgres and Django. Okay, so let's dive in Postgres generated column using some example. But first, we have to know what generated column is and when is being added in Postgres. I found out that generated column has been added in Postgres 12 in 2019, but so it's not as a recent feature, but in the recent Postgres 18, a new virtual optional has been added in it. And this is something that we can see during this presentation. Unfortunately, I found out reading the Postgres documentation that this is the only example you can find about the generated column, and it's enough to you for understand how you can use generated column, but it's not enough to think about so many different options you can have to use it, and you can use it in your project. But before showing you more this example, I want to present a bit myself. I'm Paolo Melchiorre. I'm Python Django developer. I'm from Italy. I'm on the board member of the Django Software Foundation, a PSF Fellow. I organize and help to organize PyCon Italia, which is this conference that we organize in Italy and will be at the end of May this year. I also founded Python Pescara, a local community. We organize monthly some talks and some beers. And also I'm involved in the community, trying to help as a navigator in the Django Not Space program and organize various Django Girls workshop. So as you can understand, I'll try to show you some example of Postgres generated column using Django as a project. And Django has also a very good documentation. And one part I like the most is this one. We can read in the performance and optimization section that's using Django in the right way. You have to try to use the lower level if you want to be faster. And speaking of Django and DRM, the lower level is typically the database. In fact, I like the most using in the best way the database, and today we are going to use Django with Postgres, of course. I find out reading about this new functionality in Postgres generated column, and I notice that is something that is computed by database, so it's very fast compared with Python. And reading more about it in the internal, I found out also that was something already always updated that requires no trigger, no Python code, so something very aligned with the principle we just saw before. And after discovering this functionality, I wanted to share with some other people in the Django community. In this picture, I'm at PyCon DE in Germany, specifically in Berlin. And after the pandemic period in 2022, I met Marcus and Mark here in the picture, and I tried to share with them this new functionality and the idea to implement and use it directly from the Django ORM. In fact, they give me some good feedback about this idea, and I shared also with a wider, large community of Django, writing directly from the conference and proposing them to add a Generatedfield feature to use the generated column in Postgres. And I received a very good feedback. As we do in our community, I opened the issue and I share with them my ideas. We received some feedbacks and some criticism about what we want to do to use this functionality. And then we moved to the implementation. As you can notice from the dates on this pull request, it took us a few months to open the pull request, to find all the bugs on the implementation, and to see how good was the ORM layer on top of the generated columns. And in this process, I had not time or energy to open myself the pull request, but I was involved in the reviewing the pull request and trying to find a lot of edge cases that, as you can see from the conversation, has been a lot. But at the end, we finally merged it in the Django 5.0. And just 1 year after we originally started talking about it. But as for the Postgres documentation, unfortunately, also in the Django documentation, which is quite good, this is the only one example that we were able to put in it. The Django documentation, as the Postgres one, is quite large, and I can understand that having multiple examples for every functionality would be difficult or too much for everyone to read and to update. So I decided to extract all the edge cases and the tests I did to helping in the development of the feature, and I published a series of articles to explore on my website how to use the generated column with Django, with SQLite, with Postgres specifically, and also with some geographic functionality using GeoDjango and PostGIS. Before showing you some of these examples and the next minutes, I want to quickly share how the layer of the Django ORM is on top of generated column. The generated field is a new field in the ORM. It relies on the computed value, and it relies also on the database to perform this update with no extra code and to have the data always in sync. We have some attributes to create a generated field. You have to specify the expression that you want to have that calculate the final value that has a lot of different implementation. We have to specify the output field, which is the type of the column we are going to create. And we have also to specify if the column is persistent or not. And until Postgres 17, the only way we wanted to use the generated column was the stored column. But from Postgres 18, now we can also use the not persistent, the virtual one, which is quite useful to perform a lot of writing and few reads, because the value is calculating when you read the value and not when you write in your database. Okay, let's start seeing some example here. I want to share with you some picture from Italy, where I'm from, and this is the first picture from this building, the center of Rome, which is circular. And since Roman liked a lot the circular form, I created a class that is a circle, of course. This is a Django model. I tried to use some simple class to show you how to implement some generated field. It has only a radius field, which is a float, and the generated field calculates automatically the area. We are already using some function from the Django ORM, which are at the same time some function in the Postgres layer. We are calculating the area using some function, some constant. And also I put the output field and the percentage value. The string representation for it is only needed to show you the result of this calculation. And this is the SQL code that the ORM from Django will generate for us. It's very similar to what we just saw in the Django layer, but it's SQL. It used similar function and similar variables. If we go in the Django shell, we can create directly from the shell, for example, a circle instance, giving some input for the radius, and we can see directly the calculated value for the area. It's quite easy to show what has been processed and run on the Postgres side using these two functions, and this is the SQL code that has been run by Postgres. We passed value in insert into, and we received in return the ID and the area value. So go and see another picture from Italy. This is a pastry in Venice. We can see on the glass here some piece of chocolate with some phrases. So the next class we are going to see is an item. I put on this item a price and a quantity. In this case, I also define a default for the quantity, which is a new functionality from Django 5.2, and it permits us to use the generated field in quite a small different way. So the expression is quite straightforward, and the output is similar to the price field. But the code we saw in SQL is a little bit different from before. We can see there is also a default and a check on the quantity layer. And the generated column is a multiplication from the price and quantity. But we can use in Django in two different ways now. We can specify a price and having the result from the total, but we can also specify a quantity directly. In this case, the result is different. Let's change city in Italy. This a picture from Bologna is the location when PyCon Italia will be organized this year. And this is quite in the center under the two towers in Bologna. And this is a semaphore. And every time I think about semaphore, I think about statuses. I created a class, which is an order with two date times. One is nullable, one is mandatory. And I created also a generated field to represent the status, which is quite simple, but it can show us how to use case, value, and when attributes to calculate the status based on the presence of the two date time here. So the conditional case is quite simple. If we have the payment date time, we can set the status as paid. Otherwise, we use the default value which is created. So let's go and see what is executed at database level. This is the SQL. We have the time here, and the calculation use the same function as before we saw in the Django RAM. It's very easy to read. If the payment is not null, then the status is paid, otherwise it's created. Let's move the Django shell. The creation here is straightforward. If we only put the creation date, we have this created status, or otherwise, in the second example, we have the paid one. Okay, until now, we saw very simple example that can work also in other databases like SQLite, but Django has a specific coding module specifically for Postgres. So let's activate it. We only have to add this line in the settings of our Django project. And after that, we can deep dive in what we can use from that. This is another picture from Venice. It is a Qualta library. It's very old and funny to visit. It's quite crowded with books, and it's very difficult to find some information inside the library. But I like this example to tell you about the JSON field. In fact, sometimes we put in JSON field a lot of information which is quite difficult to find. In this case, I created a package class that help us to represent packages, Python packages. We can put a name on it and also put in the JSON field all the information about the packages we can retrieve from the Python website. Let's see how we can use it. But before we saw the generated column here, try to get the information key from the info in the data in the JSON values. To retrieve the information, I use Python standard library to get Django from the pypy.org website, specifying only the name. And then after downloading all the JSON with all the information about the packages, multiple version, we can create the packages passing the JSON. And as you can see in the result, we see the Django packages and the latest version of the packages, which is the 6.0.4. Actually, we can implement it in a different way. For example, we can have only packages with the JSON field and a char field for the name, and use a Python property to extract the version from the JSON field, and it works quite well. But if we have this type of implementation, when we retrieve all the packages from our database, our column, the table, sorry, and we see that we retrieve all the data. It means we retrieve a lot of JSON information. It's not required because we only want the version. So maybe we can implement using an annotation in the Django RAM, and under the hood, we see here in the SQL that we are using only the version extracting directly from the JSON field. But if we use the generated field, this is the SQL we will have. Is simpler and is also faster. In fact, I tried to benchmark locally on my computer, and with multiple type of packages, you can see from here that using the generated field is very, very fast. This is a logarithmic representation of the differences, but of course it can be different on your computer, but I think more or less you can find that generated field is quite faster. This is another picture from Venice. It communicate me the union from people, and I want to show you some implementation of a class with using concatenation. A simple example for a person with the first and last name, and with the generated field, we can concatenate the two of them using also a space in the middle, and the result is here, a concatenation of this string. The final example is quite straightforward and it's not so complicated. But we can also use concatenation to create something more complex. For example, we can create from a person class a JSON representation and change maybe the key and the name or the content using uppercase, or concatenating only the first and last name. In this case, we have an initial. This is what happened under the hood in SQL, and this is what we'll see if we try to create and represent a person. As you can see, it's quite different from before, and it's a different way to represent it and to have a JSON representation directly in the database. But move on to Milan, another city in Italy. This is one of the oldest library in Milan. It's full of books, and it will be interesting to try to read everything on it. I created a new class, a quotes, where we can store the author name and some quotes, some text from the quotes. What I try to do here is to search on it and to create a generated field which contain a search vector to perform some full text search on it. In this example, we are trying to create a quote from Plato, and we can see that after creating it, we can also list the search vector, which removes some stop words and common words from the sentence. And if you perform a full text search using a plural and in having in the text a singular form of the same words, we succeed and we have a result. We can decide also that having the books in different languages, we can define the languages in a field, a different field, and use it in the search vector. And this is the SQL code that we have. But if we perform it, we will have a error. As we can read directly from the error, the problem is the expression is not immutable. So to avoid doing that, I use the case and when function that we just saw before, and I put every languages I want to use here. And this is actually what we are using right now to avoid the immutable limits in the Django website search. As you can see now, we have different quotes in different languages, and in every case we have a representation on the vector field, also in the case that there is some languages not supported by Postgres, like Latin. This is a beautiful hotel in the Como Lake in the northern Italy, and to book here you need, of course, a booking class. In this class we have only the start and date field, but we can generate with using a data range function date range field. It's not implemented already in the Django or Rema, but we can create it this way. And then we can see how it's represented in the SQL code. To use it, we can create a booking object, and then we can see that it's straightforward to filter all the bookings using directly a date and using the functionality of the range. We have moved to another city in Italy. This is Trieste, and in the Miramar Castle, we can see this globe. We can use also GeoDjango and its geographic functionality, just activating this in the setting the country.js. This is one of the oldest map in Italy that represents the new world, and it's quite interesting how many things we can represent. Using, for example, GeoDjango, we can represent a city with a name, a point, and we calculate various things using Generatedfield, starting from the point field. We can use PostgreSQL and GeoHash to represent the hash information from a point, like in this way. And creating a city, you can see the GeoHash, which can have multiple applications. We can also create, as before, with some concatenation, the GeoJSON representation for the city. And using the PostgreSQL function under the hood, this is what we get. Only defining the point, we can have a GeoJSON representation that is stored in the database. But since we are speaking about maps, we have to move away from Italy. And this is a picture from the straightest deserted roads in Australia. It's 90 miles long and straight. And to represent it, we only need a line string. In this case, we have a route, which are a name and a line. And we can calculate the length of the line using the generated field in this way. As before, it's used PostgreSQL function, and if we put the string and the representation of the route, we have the calculation of the kilometers in this case of the route. Okay, let's jump the world, and now we can go in Colorado. This is a beautiful picture of the states. In a while, I will say you why I took this picture to represent a state, because we can define a state border using a polygon and using a generated field to calculate the area of this polygon, which is the state representation. Under the hood, the SQL use the PostgreSQL function to calculate the area, and this is the square kilometer for the Colorado state in US. I choose this one because more or less it's a rectangle. It's very simple representation of the state. It's not exactly a rectangle, but more or less it represents it. So I used to I use the generated column because it's very simple. it has consistency, and you can use directly from the database. You can use directly in Django, but not only in Django, and it gave you cleaner and safer models, and it works also in different database, in different backends, and is very great for real world apps. My presentation is released with a Creative Commons license, so you can download it from our website. You can find my contact here, the QR code that get you to my website, paolox.net. And to finish this talk, I will show you the picture I used in so many backgrounds, which is these beautiful lakes in the northern Italy in Südtirol. Thanks so for listening.